thank you all for coming today. These statues are not just stone and metal. They're not just innocent remembrances of a benign history. These monuments celebrate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, ignoring the terror that it actually stood for.
We have an imperfect past, and we have to be accountable to it.
He grew up in the North, but journalist Connor Towne O'Neill became a teacher down in the South. And yet, it's the lesson he learned about one particular Southerner that changed the course of his life.
Now, when I was a baby, Mama named me after the great Civil War hero, General Nathan Bedford Forrest. She said we was related to him in some way, and what he did was he started up this club called the Ku Klux Klan.
Connor O'Neill knew nothing about Nathan Bedford Forrest. But when a moment in Charleston led to a movement across the South to remove symbols of the Confederacy, O'Neill began chronicling the battle, following 4 attempts to remove memorials to Nathan Bedford Forrest as a way to frame the bigger picture.
What I came to see more deeply as I was reporting this was that I did have a stake in it. It couldn't be a sort of dispassionate treatment because I came to see the ways that the whole country was implicated in these debates. I really sort of had to come to reckon with the ways that race had shaped my life too.
Now, 5 years later, O'Neill has charted his journey in Down Along with That Devil's Bones, an examination of race and racism, history versus heritage, and a country wrestling with its demons and the devil.
There is this lasting injury here, and we should feel called to take responsibility for it. I hope that the journey that I've been on in the past couple of years can be a sort of surrogate journey for the reader, too.
Connor Towne O'Neill, thanks very much for being with us today. I enjoyed the book. I'm not sure enjoyed is the right word. It was really enlightening. It's a good read, but it's a tough read sometimes because of the subject matter. In the title, the devil that's referred to is Nathan Bedford Forrest. I might add parenthetically, given that title by William Tecumseh Sherman, who was an off-and-on resident of St. Louis and today is a permanent resident of St. Louis out at Bellefontaine Cemetery. Your story actually starts in a cemetery, one of those great journalism stories, sort of like Watergate with the tape on the door leads to that whole thing. And in your case, you were a journalist in town covering a story and looking for a parking place. And because you're a journalist, of course, you were looking for a free parking place. And that's where everything started to come together for you. Tell us that story.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the attack by Alabama law enforcement officers on nonviolent demonstrators at the foot of Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge. So when 40,000 people show up, Secret Service is in town, it's tough to find a parking spot. And so I figured I might have some luck over in the cemetery that's just a couple blocks from downtown. It's one of these, very sort of midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil cliched Southern cemeteries, mausoleums, Spanish moss. It's got its own system of roads. And so I think, okay, I'll stash my car in there. I'll jog down to the bridge and I'll catch this speech. And I ended up finding way more than I bargained for. So as I pull in, I start to see signs stuck in the grass that say Confederate Memorial Circle closed, no trespassing. And, that's kind of catnip for a reporter. So get out of my car and I walk over, and there are a couple of people sort of scowling at me as I approach. And I just ask them, sort of naively, honestly, what are you doing here? Are you standing guard? What's the deal here? And come to find that this group, the Friends of Forrest, as they call themselves, had spent, the better part of 2 decades by that point fighting about this statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, that they had put up and had been stolen. And then there was a big fight about whether or not they could replace it. And so they were out there that day because they had won this battle in federal court that was going to allow them to put up a second statue of Forrest. And they were sort of preparing the grounds for that for that rededication. And the dissonance of that, encountering this group of neo-Confederates on a day of, somber civil rights commemoration, really struck a nerve and kind of gave me whiplash, honestly. I didn't know much about who Forrest was or what it meant to put up a monument to him in 2015, but it really sort of stuck in my head. And so I start to read up about Forrest, start to find that there are these monuments of him across the South. There's a county named after him in Mississippi, a city named after him in Arkansas, state parks, schools, and of course, all of these statues. So I start poking around, start researching a little bit. And then that summer, the Charleston 9 murders happen. And so in the aftermath of the Charleston 9 murders, people start it sparks a referendum on Confederate symbols, the flag, monuments, schools named after Confederates. And because of this encounter that I had with the Friends of Forrest, I decided I'm going to start following some of these protest campaigns aimed at Forrest monuments in particular.
Now, you're a Northerner living in Alabama, teaching in Alabama, which is why you were there. Did you know much about Nathan Bedford Forrest before you started this? Because I think most people above the Mason-Dixon line, unless they saw Forrest Gump, where there's that sort of passing humorous reference to him, don't know much about him. Who was he exactly?
Yeah, that's all I had to go on before that. I stumble into that cemetery. Yeah, I didn't know much about him. He's not sort of part of the lore growing up in Pennsylvania. But I talked to Madison Smart Bell, who's the great novelist from Nashville, who has a novel about Forrest. And he told me that growing up in Middle Tennessee, Forrest was just the water that you swam in. So it really is a regional thing. He's this kind of, like mythic sort of white folk hero for white Southerners. And he's really controversial too. He's seen by the people who want to venerate him as this kind of instinctual military leader, a self-made man, unlike Lee, who is this embodiment of the sort of Southern gentleman who had gone to West Point, one of the first families of Virginia. Forrest, by contrast, grows up poor, didn't go to West Point, hardly went to school at all. He makes a fortune in the slave trade. He equips his own cavalry regiment at the outbreak of the war, and he enlists as a private. Again, he's not the West Point type. But distinguishes himself as a military leader, as the most promoted soldier from the North or the South over the course of the war. And there's a good amount in how he's remembered increasingly over the course of the 20th century. How he's remembered has a lot to do with how he's used or not used during the Civil War. He's the sort of like people that want to Monday morning quarterback the Civil War will point to Forrest and say, oh, if only he had been promoted sooner, if only, he had been given the shot that Lee had to really win this war, then the South might have won. So that, the sort of South will rise again. People are thinking they'll do that through Forrest. After the war, he's the first Grand Wizard of the Klan. Is central to the undermining of Reconstruction and returning the South to, ex-Confederate rule, leading to the implementation of Jim Crow, and of course to allow them to hoist statues to their heroes, which is why we have so many of these Confederate monuments. So looking at Forrest was a really revealing way of looking at this history, both what led up to the war and the aftermath and the long consequences and the unresolved tensions of the war afterwards.
You followed 4 examples in your book. Any idea how many statues there are or things named after Nathan Bedford Forrest in the South?
There's probably, all told, there's probably over 100, if you count street names, school names, statues, historical markers, those blue plaques. He's everywhere.
Well, and what's astounding about it when you think about it is in a lot of these cities where these markers or memorials or statues are black majority cities, or at least cities with substantial black populations. You'd think if any place was able to get rid of these things, it would be those cities, but not so.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that underscores who the intended audience is for a lot of these markers, sort of reminder of, a recalcitrant sort of white power even in places like Selma or Memphis.
Yeah, because these weren't put up right after the war. They were put up decades later.
No, that's right. Yeah, the Southern Poverty Law Center does a great job of keeping track of, the numbers of monuments, and then, of course, also charting when they go up. And you see the two big spikes in Confederate symbols come in, the turn of the century. So after Reconstruction had been undermined and the former Confederates are returning to power, they go about, hoisting statues to their heroes then. And then, of course, in the middle of the 20th century, as a sort of symbolic response or rebuke to the civil rights movement. And that's especially when you see names of schools come to get Forrest or Lee or Stonewall Jackson or Jefferson Davis as a sort of response to Brown v. Board and efforts at integration of these schools.
Well, and of course, in your book, one of the four memorials, I guess you would call it, although it's not a statue, is at Middle Tennessee State University, where it's just a building named for him. That would be easy to change, you would think, but not in Tennessee.
You'd think so. Yeah, you'd think so. There's a sort of, almost Kafkaesque process that you have to go through in Tennessee to change anything, that monument or that bears a historical name. It requires a super majority of votes from the state's historical commission to approve any change there. So when students on campus at Middle Tennessee State wanted to change the name of Forrest Hall, first they had to convince the school to do it. And that took a whole year of protests and forums and debates. And then finally they convinced the school administration to do it, but then the school administration had to ask the Board of Regents that oversees that. They convinced the Board of Regents, but then the Board of Regents has to take it to the Historical Commission, and the Historical Commission says no.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the statue in Memphis, it was obviously the same process. It went on forever, and the only way they finally got anything done was this sort of, I don't know if you'd call it a loophole, but this kind of end run that they did to be able to get rid of the statue.
That's right. Yeah, I think they realized, twice the city of Memphis appealed to this same historical commission to get this 30-foot bronze equestrian statue of Forrest taken down. And twice they were denied by that commission. And so there was the looming anniversary of the 50 years since the assassination of Martin Luther King. And so I think the city felt a lot of pressure to get that statue down and eventually sold it. They sold it to a county commissioner for, I think, or they sold the park, rather, that the statue was in. And then once it was privately owned, it wasn't subject to this state law, the Heritage Protection Act. And, as soon as the ink is dry on that bill of sale, the statue comes down. So, yeah, it was a pretty canny loophole that they threaded. The state legislature was pretty angry with them for doing that and withheld some funding that they were going to give for the bicentennial celebrations of the city as a kind of retaliation for that. But, yeah, it took some doing, but they managed to get the statue down finally.
Well, this became a very personal thing for you in reading the book. It wasn't just this sort of dispassionate journalist going around and writing down some facts and figures, which is really what makes it interesting and very moving in parts when you're talking about, trying to reconcile all this with your own north of the Mason-Dixon line whiteness. Talk about that a little bit, because that's an unusual approach.
Yeah. I think when I first started the book, there was so much to cover and report on, so many people to talk to, archives to visit, monuments to see, that at first it felt like, I could do a much more sort of dispassionate third person approach here. But what I came to see more deeply as I was reporting this was that I did have a stake in it. It couldn't be a sort of dispassionate treatment, because I came to see the ways that the whole country was implicated in these debates, and to not point out that, a good white liberal from Pennsylvania couldn't absent himself from this debate, which is what we like to do, which is, because I think the received wisdom growing up in the North especially was like, the Civil War, that's a Southern thing. We're above the Mason-Dixon line. We're affiliated with the Union Army. We're on the good side of this. We don't really have to think about it. And in the same way, we think, insofar as race is still a problem in this country, it's a problem in people's hearts, and it exists down there. But really, the more that I dug into the sweeping history that is embodied in these monuments, the slave society that was creating massive amounts of wealth for people in the North as well as the South, that was leading up to the war, the ways in which the racial hierarchy that the Confederacy sought to protect persisted long after the end of the war and existed in the North just as it existed in the South. I really sort of had to come to reckon with the ways that race had shaped my life too. The ways that my school was zoned and funded had to do with race. The ways that my parents were able to, apply for loans and buy a house, the neighborhood that they could buy a house in had to do with their race. The way that I was seen by police officers had to do with my race. All of these different ways, all the different lines that my life was built on, had to do with the frankly sort of psychotic ideas of race that exist in America and that are meant to provide opportunities to some at the expense of others. It seems like more and more people are coming to understand the way that race is shaping their life and think more pointedly about ideas like whiteness. I hope that the journey that I've been on in the past couple of years can be a sort of surrogate journey for the reader too.
I guess for a lot of us who maybe knew that there were these statues around, didn't think about it much. But if you take a few steps back and look at it, it's sort of, wait a minute. In countries where wars are lost, the first thing they do is pull down the statues of the people who were leading the other side. I mean, after World War II, they started renaming streets that had German names. And if you go to Berlin, and I think maybe you've been, the whole town is nothing but an apology. There are all these memorials everywhere. There's certainly no statues of Hitler anywhere. So how did it get to this point?
Well, I think, you're right. Like the losers typically don't get to put up statues. But I think we can read the presence of all of these Confederate monuments as an indication that even though the South might have lost the military conflict, ideologically, the ideals that they were fighting for persisted. This
is that whole lost cause mentality.
Yeah. This idea that, the war might have led to the emancipation of the enslaved, but the justification that they were using and that the Americans North and South were using for this slave society was not just that some people happened to be enslaved. No, the Black Americans that were being enslaved, that was their sort of natural state. That was the argument of the Confederacy. And they were telling really anyone who would listen. If you go back and look at speeches in the build up to the war, Jefferson Davis, Alexander H. Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, were saying, look, we are fighting explicitly to maintain slavery and expand it west. And we're doing it because there's an inherent inferiority in Black Americans that justifies this, morally, this moral abomination. They're content with it. They're just a subhuman. And so the war that the Confederacy lost meant that that emancipation would be a result of the war, but that deeper lie about white supremacy and Black inferiority persists. I mean, we still have this racial hierarchy because we haven't been able to address that root cause of the war. And so one of the expressions of that failure to really reckon with the deeper issues of building a country as a slave society are these Confederate monuments.
A few of these things have come down. We had a monument here in oddly enough, Forrest Park, 1R, not 2. Because I know there's a Forest Park for Nathan.
I know I've been misspelling Forest for years now because I want to put that second R in.
But in our Forest Park, there was a Confederate memorial that became controversial during all of this, and it was taken up. And the idea is to put it in a museum someday, which seems to be always what they say. Oh, well, let's put it in a museum someday. I don't know that any of these are actually going to museums, or the museums have space for them. But at least that's what they say when they take them up. But as this continues, if it continues to grow, is it sort of a palliative? I mean, after Barack Obama was elected, we all said, oh, it's post-racial America now. Hey, hey, we renamed the Washington Redskins, a little side topic there, but same idea. We pulled down a couple of statues. We're good. I mean, could it die right there?
I mean, again, this is, so much of this work has revealed like the ways that we use history in convenient ways and use symbolic gestures as a way of sidestepping, deeper, tougher questions. Yeah, I mean, right. So a couple have come down, and that's certainly a good thing. And especially, I think there's power in a lot of the images that we've seen this summer. I think that can be really powerful. And I think the hope is that people understand it as a beginning, right? More and more people are one, just seeing them. I think we've sort of been habituated to these statues and just kind of taken them for granted. More and more people are seeing them and seeing the wrong in them and wanting to get them down. And I think that's good. And I think, ideally we can see it as a beginning. It's wrong because they're symbols of these deeper underlying, broader inequities, whether that's, the extrajudicial killing Black Americans by police officers who are able to do it with impunity, whether that's the disparate deaths by race from the coronavirus, exposing the, unequal access to healthcare that we have. In so many ways, if we can use the uprising against these statues to then, tune into the deeper wrongs, the deeper inequities that they're symbols of, then I think that can be a really useful way of furthering protest and furthering reform and furthering, the long, difficult process of squaring up to the history of this country that is, we like to think of as flattering us and being about, forging, making the Union more perfect and being this history of progress. But that there is this lasting injury here, and that we should feel called to take responsibility for it.
What is your take on the slippery slope argument that I assume is what is being made? Once you start this, where do you stop? So many presidents, great presidents, were slave owners. Once you go down this road, how do you get off of it, or where do you stop? Or do you stop? Should we just take them all down?
I mean, I think I'm inclined to defer to the people who live in the particular place where those particular statues are. If they want them down, then they're going to try and get them down. If they want them to stay up, they're going to do what they can to try and get them to stay up. It's always going to be that sort of power struggle. In terms of the slippery slope thing, I don't know. I think that I sort of welcome referendums on people whenever they happen. Again, I think we have this sort of naive view of history that it needs to be all good, or that figures from our history can't be complicated, nuanced, contradictory figures. So yeah, I think we're getting closer to a consensus on the Confederate monuments. I think more people are willing to admit the wrong there, and that to defend them now you have to be more explicitly sort of white supremacist in your views to defend them. And then the more complicated ones, like the founding fathers, I think it's great to have a public referendum on who they were and what their legacy is. Whether or not they come down, I don't know. But I think asking people to wrestle with the fact that these men that we're taught to revere, these sort of geniuses of the Enlightenment that were able to construct this country that's predicated on liberty and freedom, they can be complicated, contradictory figures who also stood for really abhorrent ideas, like the idea that you might count an enslaved person as 3/5 of a human. The referendum on their legacies, I think, is great. I mean, especially when it seems like the prevailing view in how we interpret the Constitution now is that these men were infallible, and the only way we can think about how to interpret the Constitution was by somehow like looking into their heads and trying to understand what they meant. So having a reaction to that being like, no, maybe these guys weren't perfect and had some really, really abhorrent ideas that led to a lot of inequity that we should look to think twice about and undo rather than double down on and just take their word as gospel, I think is really important, and I welcome it. Whatever's further down that slippery slope, I think we'll have a debate about when we get there. And that debate will be good because once more, we'll have to reckon with the fact that we have an imperfect past and we have to be accountable to it.
Well, it's certainly an interesting topic and one that we can't solve in the half an hour or so that we've got to talk about it. But I do really sincerely recommend the book. It's really interesting, very thoughtful, very thought-provoking. Down Along with That Devil's Bones is the name of the book. Connor O'Neill, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for reading and thanks for asking such thoughtful questions. That ghostly battle still rages. Same war, same general. Storms gather, waters rise. Ending this war will require a moral clarity about the meaning and consequence of America's past, one that few Americans have proved capable of. Because simply knowing our history cannot redeem us, cannot, as they say in Selma, get us to the beyond. Knowledge alone cannot make the nation more just or equitable, nor does it create or change policy. Knowledge alone cannot undo what's been done in white America's name.